Subscribe to The Honest Critique for current affairs, movie, book, and product reviews. Also, make sure you press the bell icon to get notified whenever we upload a new video. The views, information, or opinions expressed during the video series are solely those of the individuals and do not necessarily represent those of The Honest Critique and its employees. The following video contains strong language which may be offensive to some viewers. Viewer discretion advised.
Hello, welcome to a very special episode we are recording today. And in this exclusive interview, we have the privilege to engage with Ms. María Fernanda, a distinguished diplomat and global leader with a remarkable career spanning over 2 decades in multilateral diplomacy. Ms. María has held significant positions, including being the president of the 73rd session of the United Nations General Assembly. She has served Ecuador as a Minister of Foreign Affairs twice, Minister of National Defense, and Coordinating Minister of Natural and Cultural Heritage. So thank you so much, ma'am, for taking your time and speaking to us.
Well, thank you very much. And discuss about world affairs. And very, very privileged to be having this conversation today.
Sure, thank you so much, ma'am. I want to start with the first question, that your tenure as the president of the 73rd session of the General Assembly, you prioritize gender equality. So could you reflect a little bit on the progress made during your presidency in promoting meaningful participation and representation of women in decision-making spaces at the international level?
Well, indeed, I chose 7 priorities during my tenure as president, and I said, because it has to be one priority per day of the week, and we will work 24/7, for the organization, which ended up being like that because we didn't stop. It was hard work, but it was worthwhile. Among the 7 priorities, gender equality, especially gender equality in the international scene, which I think it's not that you begin the work and you end the work. When you look at the recent assessments on how well we're doing in implementing SDG 5 and gender equality around the world, it's really shocking to see that progress has not been incremental, that we are experiencing strong regressions and setbacks in gender equality, that no country has fully achieved gender equality, and every effort counts. And we should not take the gains we have made for granted, because then you can lose them if you don't continue to bring the issue, to keep the issue. I made sure it's not about having women discussing about women's issues and speaking among women. It is about placing women in leadership positions in the international system. It is learning from international female leaders. It is about making sure that every single decision at the UN takes into consideration gender equality and the rights of women and girls, because of various reasons. And the data and the numbers are abundant. I mean, the huge gaps on everything, on political participation, on having more women and girls that are in extreme poverty, more women and girls that do not have access to water and sanitation and to safe energy and access to health services, etc. You name it. Salary gaps, women in STEM. Everywhere you look, there is a gender gap. So basically, I made sure that gender equality and a gender equality lens was used in all discussions and decisions in the more than 330 resolutions passed by the General Assembly. The second issue is that I was able to gather twice female heads of state and government to come to New York and to discuss what it's like, to be a woman leading a country, being in charge of a country, and really learning from what a feminine leadership style means, in terms of performance of our democracies, of our development priorities, on climate, etc. So I had this Women in Power series with women heads of state and government. I appointed a senior level advisory group on women that remains. I mean, that was I started a tradition that has remained throughout the different presidencies, even the current brand new presidency. And it's hard to say how much that has closed the gaps, the gender inequality gaps worldwide. But I can tell you, and I feel very proud of that, to have brought women front and center of UN debates, of UN discussions, in looking at what feminine power can do. And feminine power can come either from men or women. It's a style of leadership. It is a empathy and in way in empathy and in a good understanding of what it needs. It's women in the peace and security agenda as well. So that was extremely present. I think that optics are also important in the international scene. I was only the fourth female president in the 78 years of history of the UN. I remain the last one, a few years ago, and we would like to see more of that. But you saw that I did not organize any expert panel, any event that didn't have gender balance as well. So optics count, the approach and the cross-cutting nature counts, and also affirmative action for women in diplomacy, women in top positions of decision-making counts. And having these advisory mechanisms for gender equality at the General Assembly, also I think it started a very positive tradition that remains until today.
Well, that actually answers the question broadly of how and what you have done, actually. And that's very inspiring, actually, for us to look back at presidency. And I want to now look back a little bit at your journey, like as you mentioning, that you were the first woman to actually even become permanent representative of Ecuador to the United Nations in 2008 and to serve as the president of the General Assembly. So what were the most significant milestones and challenges you have encountered during this journey? If you could even talk a little bit from the gender lens as well.
Well, I really hope that one day we're going to just, stop saying I was the first. And sometimes it's the first and only, which is really not very promising. So indeed, I was the first permanent representative in New York, but also in Geneva. I was ambassador in both places. I was the first and only ambassador until today. And that is, we have to all, of course, grab the opportunity and make the difference. But I wouldn't want to say and continue to say that I was the first and only so far. Of course, after being Minister of Defense and Minister of Foreign Affairs, also among the very, very few around the world, I think it's both a privilege but also a great responsibility, because people look at you, with a magnifier glass to see how well you're performing, if you are well equipped, if you are capable, if you have the merit. And believe me that the scrutiny is higher when there is a woman at the highest level of an organization, and people start asking if you're well qualified and all of that, which doesn't happen for men. Quite honestly, people don't speak about merit and about if the person is fit for purpose, etc. With women, it does happen. It has happened to me, and you feel that you have to prove yourself, and the responsibility is greater. the challenges are greater, and I feel that I need to perform, the best I can. It's not only a personal, issue. It's because I want more women to follow me in a way, especially the younger generation. So you feel you have to be, you have to leave, a strong legacy. You have to give, an example that women are capable, and we can perform, and we can perform well. And I'm always thinking about younger generations, about young diplomats with the highest ambitions. They should be ambitious and audacious, and really know that they are capable as well. So I think that the translation of that is hard work. It's push for the highest possible performance, and to set a good example. I'm not saying that everything you do is perfect and it's 100%, but I think the intention and the drive and the passion to do things well is there, and I think it's important.
I am sure that things will settle and probably will not just be the only one, and a lot of other women will do come, and that's what even we wish to see. And now coming actually to your presidency, you emphasize a lot on revitalization of the United Nations, and you propose crucial reforms under pillars such as peace and security, development, and management reforms. Now, in retrospect, what were the outcomes of the reform efforts, and how did they address the criticism of the inefficiency and bureaucracy that the UN has often been criticized of?
Well, I have to say that wasn't at all my initiative. There was a reform agenda that was proposed by the current Secretary General, a 3-pillar reform agenda on management, on development, and on peace and security. These were reforms that were highly needed for the system to perform better on the ground. For example, on the development pillar is to improve the coordination and the cross-agency performance and coordination at the ground level of the UN. The management reform was directed to manage better the resources and the capacities of the organization in a more modern way. And that included, the human capital of the organization, but the budgeting, the priority setting, the decision making under these the management pillar, and this reform on the peace and security pillar was geared towards a greater emphasis on peace building and prevention than a response to conflict. It's not an either or, but for example, the department on DPA became DPPA, and this is not only a name change. The Department of Political Affairs it became the DPPA, which is basically more geared towards prevention and peace building, which I think it's the right approach for the UN. So this reform, it's still in progress. It's still being implemented. To be quite honest, I haven't followed the assessment of how well the reform has gone, but there was the political backing of member states, which is important. And I think that this 3-pillar reform was timely and much needed. And of course, I'm a strong believer that a profound structural reform of the UN needs to happen, and needs to happen now. And we should take the advantage of the upcoming Summit of the Future to make it happen in 2024.
I think 1.4 billion voices, you've answered it for. A lot of Indians do want to see reforms in the United Nations, actually, especially the legacies of the World War II that have carried on in the United Nations. A lot of Indians even have proposed, and we do have a lot of suggestions for the UNSC permanent seat, and a lot of there have been conversations, and I'll come to that a little later, but one of your cross-cutting priorities, even during your presidency, was environmental action. And you even mentioned in the earlier answer of how you reflected on certain initiatives and campaigns, such as the global campaign against plastic pollution that you championed to promote environmental sustainability and the impact they had on collective action towards addressing environmental challenges. So could you just talk a little bit on that?
Well, you said the post World War II scenario has dramatically changed, and one of the things and the aspects that have changed dramatically is the relationship between our societies, our consumption and production models, our economies, and the environment. I have said many times that unfortunately our generation has declared war on nature, and that we need a reconciliation process. And it's not only about biodiversity loss or air pollution or climate change. It's all of them together. It's a planetary crisis that we are experiencing. Therefore, our capacity to respond, our capacity to heal this broken relationship with nature has to be systemic, and has to be holistic in a way. And of course, I have devoted many years of my life to work on climate change, but climate change is a symptom of this, broken relationship between the ways we produce and consume and the planetary boundaries. And climate change is a symptom of that fracture in a way. So responses have to come from a whole of society approach, whole of government approach. It cannot be one ministry dealing with the climate and disease and reporting to the convention, and separately looking at the biodiversity and biodiversity protection and the Montreal Kunming new biodiversity framework separately. Oceans here, it's a very Western way of looking at things. You put oceans here and you put biodiversity here, and climate there, and let's say wetlands here, etc. But nature does not recognize these boundaries, this siloed approach. So, of course, plastics was a great concern, because I saw that something bold needed to happen. My played out campaign in this world campaign against single-use plastics, I think was perhaps, I say this in all humility, because that was teamwork, but that was a strong call for an international agreement on single-use plastics. And fortunately enough, we started a process that now has ended with the adoption of a new treaty against single-use plastics. I was able even to have the UN and the UN venues to be free of single-use plastics. And we had this motto, fantastic, the UN without single-use plastic. And these seem like very small battles, but they had a strong meaning. For me, I was very uncomfortable coming inside the UN headquarters in New York and looking at all these plastic bottles around and plastic containers around. And I said, no, this has to change. And we were able to change that with the support of the Secretary General, and being successful. So now, if you go to Nairobi, or you go to Geneva or New York, you will see that at least the UN venues do not use plastic anymore. And more importantly, that now we have a convention, we have an international agreement to really regulate how we use, how we process, and how we clean our planet from plastic pollution. Plastic pollution, as we know, was killing our oceans, was killing fertile ground, was affecting water, was affecting human health. it is a big issue. And yet again, this has to be connected to a broader, transformation of our production and consumption patterns. And that includes, of course, climate, and that includes biodiversity laws as well.
And the other important thing that I want to talk about during your presidency, and even now, one of the most debated issues is on migration. And looking back, how did the member states engage with and implement the objectives of this non-binding compact to ensure safe, orderly, and management of migration? And we have seen recently, ma'am, that there has been a rise of nationalism, anti-migrant sentiments across Europe and even America as well. So what strategies were employed during your tenure to combat such as xenophobia, racism, and cultural backlash against the migrants?
Well, first of all, the fight against racism, xenophobia, all sorts of hate speech and discrimination because of race or faith or gender, it's very much part of the UN agenda. And of course, I put a lot of weight into that because that was the year, remember, of this terrible, devastating attacks on mosques and synagogues in California, in New Zealand, in many places. So the hate speech, but also all forms of discrimination are very much on top of the xenophobia. Is very much, on top of the agenda. And of course, the process of having an international compact on migration was one of the challenges I had as president of the General Assembly. And I say challenges because, of course, there was a different views and opinions about the compact, very tense discussions among member states, and the bridging of positions and bringing all the 193 voices together on the issue of migration was extremely difficult, and perhaps one of the most challenging responsibilities I had as president of the General Assembly. And of course, there are some countries that, as you know, have very strong policies against migrants and people on the move. And unfortunately, if we do not stabilize climate, only climate-related migrants would be, 1.5 billion by 2050, and these are very conservative numbers. But if you add to the climate crisis, you add the food crisis that is interconnected, you add water stress in many parts of the world, if you add conflict and armed conflict in many parts of the world, I think that the DNA of our future in the next decade is going to be dealing with people on the move. Because no human in its right mind decides to leave your home country and your family under unknown and dangerous circumstances just because you want the adventure. No one does that. If you live a comfortable life, a safe life, if you have a safe environment, livelihood that you can trust, you stay where you are. I mean, that's obvious. So the people that are, forced to move, it's because they feel unsafe and they don't see a future for them and their families. So it's very easy to explain, but very difficult to process that, into the diplomatic and in political terms. And of course, each country is sovereign and it's entitled to take its own decisions, but this is going to be a part of it is today, and it's going to be even more so in the near future, So humans, our societies, our countries, we have to come to grips on how to handle migration in a way that it respects the human rights of people on the move, to start with, and the right of humans to be in places where they feel safe and where they feel they have a future. And that's why the compact on safe and orderly migration was so critical and important. You mentioned that it is not legally binding, and indeed it's not legally binding, but it's intended to be a normative framework to help countries to deal with the migration issues and really abide by human rights law internationally, and put human lives, on top of the priorities, and also work on prevention. It is so important that we prevent migration. The best way to prevent migration is to implement the Sustainable Development Goals, for example, to reduce poverty, to reduce inequalities, to build safer environments, to implement the Paris Agreement on climate and meet the goals of the Paris Agreement, that is crystal clear. It's net zero emissions by 2050 and cutting in half emissions by 2030. I mean, it's written there, and do not exceed the 1.5 degrees increase in temperature. We know what we need to do, and yet we are unable. And every time that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change delivers a new statement or a new report, believe me that I am very nervous, because I know what I'm going to find, or their production modes, even though we have tracked carbon throughout the supply chains, and we know exactly the shipping industry and the aviation industry, how to improve all of our carbon footprint, yet we are not able to deliver, which is frustrating in a way. In here again is where the systemic approach to respond to the planetary crisis comes, and there is science, the planetary boundary science, that tells you we have reached limits in so many planetary boundaries, including on the atmosphere and how we use our atmospheric space, on pollution, on water. We are reaching tipping points, and so there is, and the only way to deal with these issues, of course, it's the political leadership. Well, in basically, I said that to address the planetary crisis and what it's being called now the triple planetary crisis on pollution, biodiversity loss, and climate. I would say that there is a strong need for a systemic approach, for a systems approach, looking at planetary boundaries and the carrying capacity of planet Earth, which is not unlimited. And so there is a lot of homework there to do, not only on the climate front, but in all the other environmental fronts. But we definitely need the 200 plus multilateral environmental agreements to come together and have coherence and connect to each other. And the only way to solve this triple planetary crisis is through a strong multilateral system.
In fact, that is what my next question is actually, ma'am, on multilateralism, because even during your term, you have laid a very strong importance on multilateralism. And it was a very heightened political, during a heightened political time as well. Now, looking back at your efforts, how did you encourage dialogue and foster cooperation among member states to counteract the challenges faced by multilateralism and maintain its relevance in addressing global issues? As we have heard a lot of conversation that in a shifting global power landscape, is the UN still relevant and has a central role in navigating international affairs?
Well, I think that the world of today, where we are so interconnected and interdependent, even more than what we think, we realized during the COVID crisis and the COVID pandemic that we really dependent. We were really highly dependent on other societies in other places for our supply chains, for our own health and survival. We were depending on the neighbor and how well we follow the rules on COVID. So, and we realized not only that we were interdependent, but as a species, we were extremely fragile and vulnerable. And I think that was a wake-up call for us. The same goes for the climate crisis. The same goes in the fight against inequalities and poverty. We understand that these issues require, multilateral responses, require collective action, require concerted action. And the place to do that, of course, are regional organizations, strong and powerful regional organizations like the African Union or the Asian and ASEAN, and new and old configurations like the G20 or the BRICS. But there is one place which I call the G193 place, which is the UN. It's irreplaceable. And we know that there are weaknesses that we would like to see the UN being, as the motto of my presidency said, making the UN relevant for all, that there are many shortcomings, but the UN is also a human-made organization. That, so the reform, the rejuvenation, the retooling of the UN has to be human-made as well. There is no energy that is wise energy coming from the sky and transforming the UN. Is not going to happen. It's our brains and souls and intelligence that is going to design an organization that is fit for the 21st century challenges. There is no other alternative. When people criticize the UN over and over again, most of the critiques, I agree with them, but we don't have a plan B. Where is the space where we all come together under, the sovereign equality of all? The General Assembly is the most universal democratic body that we have. Countries small and big, they have the same seat, the same microphone to speak, and the same button to vote on things that matter to the world and to our societies. So that's why I've been so insistent on the need to revitalize our multilateral system, to reform, to modernize the multilateral system, and more concretely the UN. There is a lot of homework ahead of us. It's not that we're going to reach the Summit of the Future next September and just everything is fixed. It's not going to happen, but at least it's going to be a peak moment of political attention, to carefully craft the reform agenda for the coming years, and to say what are the priorities, what are the quick gains, things that we can make happen and change quickly. And it's a matter just of getting together and take decisions on certain things, things that look like minor issues, but we have the member states have decided to have a full-fledged office on youth, and we're still waiting. There is the youth office is not quite there. It's a minor thing, but it's going to be an intergenerational perspective of the work of the UN. It's very important. And the decision of upgrading the current office of the special youth envoy, for example. Things like that can be done quite quickly. As I said, quick gains, easy to do, easy to harvest, plus more midterm changes and transformations, and long-term profound structural changes. But all these roadmap has to be written somewhere. which is the Pact for the Future that is expected for next year, and to have a clear roadmap in the same way we have the 2030 agenda, and we know that by 2030 there's certain things that we need to do individually as member states, but also collectively. So these are the expectations. I am, in spite of the very tense, very polarized international environment, I think that there is no way out of a profound reform of the UN. And if we don't want the system to lose relevance, traction, and political attention.
I agree, in fact, how multilateralism is still the future, and UN holds a great position in that. In fact, I have a question that I really want, like the moment we knew that you were coming, and I wanted to ask you this because this was one of the most important thing in your term, that the United States withdrew from international agreements during that time, like the Paris Climate Agreement, and even declined to participate in the Global Compact on Migration. Now, as the leader of the General Assembly, how did you actually address these global challenges, and how did the organization even were adapting to maintain this effectiveness despite such withdrawals from significant actors?
Yeah, well, and basically, I was saying that, the multilateral system is about reaching agreement and reaching consensus in finding common ground. That's how the system is designed for. But also, I think more and more, we have to be prepared for dissent and for countries that are in disagreement. And to process that is also part of diplomacy and of the sovereign right of a country to say, I am not supporting that. Of course, the ideal scenario is to find common ground, to find consensus, to find agreement on the important matters that the UN in general, and in particular the General Assembly, addresses. And I think that part of the wisdom of good diplomacy is how to deal with dissent. And we have to learn how to deal with dissent, of course.
And in this light, I wanted to ask you about your take on the G20 presidency of India, actually. We have seen actually how India has emerged in this particular meeting as one of the voice of the global South, and has played a significant role in getting African Union as a permanent member of G20. So how do you assess India's ascendancy actually in this meeting and India's G20 presidency?
Well, I think that to have the African Union join the G20 was really, a big gain for the G20 to have a permanent voice of Africa in the discussions, negotiations, and agreement within the G20. And the role of India has always been a very constructive role in the multilateral scene, and that's extremely important, because we are speaking about the most populated country in planet Earth, but a country that has taken the lead in so many fronts, including on renewable energies, on innovation and technology, in many other fronts. So I think that the commitment of India to multilateralism in general has to be appreciated and acknowledged. And from my end, of course, the first ever female president of the UN General Assembly was a woman from India that I greatly admire, and that she left an incredible legacy, Vijaya Lakshmi Pandit. So I look up to her also when I had to deal with difficult moments at the General Assembly. And she was a trailblazer, an example to us. And I'm sure that she never expected, to have the General Assembly, being led by three other women in that set, and the three other women coming from the Global South as well, because it was India, Liberia, Bahrain, and Ecuador, my country. So we are expecting for more, and that's why in my position as executive director of Global Women Leaders Voices, we are calling for gender alternation for the presidency of the UN General Assembly, to keep, of course, regional rotation, but gender alternation at the same time.
So, ma'am, I have like three last questions, and these are like related to the current meeting that took place. So during the 78th session of the United Nations General Assembly, I read your comment and you emphasized that there is a need for women-led global governance design. Looking back, what strategies were supposed to be there to integrate feminist perspectives into the design of multilateral system? And why is the integration crucial for achieving an inclusive and effective governance?
Well, I think that a governance is the way you take decisions, you establish policies, etc. The way institutions are designed, and there is also the building of a political culture. And you cannot have effective governance if you leave 50% plus of the world's population outside of that. So it's unthinkable. Unfortunately, the international system has for a long time been, male-driven. And these are the things that need to change. And we produced, as GWL Voices, a report called Numbers Matter, as you know, where we track the number of women at the highest levels and highest positions in the international system. And the truth is that the numbers are not very promising. It means that we need to continue to work. And it's not only about having the numbers right, having the demographic justice right, but having the perspectives and the needs and the rights of women reflected in the way decisions are made, in the policies that we are designing, in the actions we are implementing in the ground, in the investments that you're doing. That's why there is a lot of discussions now about the need to reform the international financial architecture, so that these designs of a new financial architecture should also place women and girls front and center.
So how has the progress report actually on sustainable development goal emphasized the urgency of addressing gender gaps, especially in workplace management positions? And what actions were highlighted to bridge this gap? Because we have seen the importance of gender equality emphasized. So could you just talk about how it's tied to achieving the sustainable development goals and fostering a safer planet?
Well, basically, and unfortunately, all the reports on the progress made with the SDGs and this midpoint moment of the summit. We have only 7 years to go, and of course the idea is to cross correct and to boost action and boost investment, in basically make sure that we deliver on the critical issues. And what is critical, I think, are the means of implementation. If you see that only 15% of the targets in the goals, the targets and the indicators are on track, 15%, after all these years is really not good enough. And when you look at the UN, the SDG Summit Political Declaration, I think it's quite encouraging. It's encouraging because it speaks about a stimulus package of at least 500 billion a year for implementing the SDGs. It speaks about debt restructuring because the majority of low and middle income countries are in situations of debt distress. It speaks about technology transfer and capacity building. All of this is critical for the future of the implementation of the SDGs, and perhaps more importantly, to keep the SDGs on top of the political agenda and as part of the narrative and the commitment of world leaders. And that's in a way what happened during the SDG summit in New York. I was, it's not perfect, but quite pleased the political declaration that came out of the summit. So the purpose, I think, and the main objective of the summit was met, and we have really to push for accelerating implementation, and that very much depends, as I said, of the means of implementation, to multiply public investment in the SDGs, to multiply, transfer of low carbon technologies to the developing countries, and it also implies boosting capacities, especially in low and middle income countries, and this is the challenge, but also the homework ahead of us. And we have to say that no country, including the developing countries of the North, have deployed, a high standard of implementation of the SDGs because of many reasons that we all know, the COVID pandemic, the Ukraine, and many other factors. But we need the political will. I hope that was the energy that came out of the SDG Summit in New York.
Well, thank you so much, ma'am, for that. And thank you so much for taking your time and speaking to us.
Wonderful. Thank you. Have a good afternoon.